My name is Joshua Blevins Peck. If you don't already know me, this is going to be my first attempt at a video review online. We'll see how it goes. I want to talk a little bit about Whit Stillman and the three films that he made from 1990 to 1998. The three films in the order of release were Metropolitan, Barcelona, and The Last Days of Disco. I watched The Last Days of Disco a couple of nights ago, and a friend and I had watched all three of them in order, and thought it'd be a nice thing to talk about because they're kind of an underappreciated trio of films. The first film, Metropolitan, came out in 1990. It was very low budget. It was filmed mostly at night. And the story involves a group of wealthy, well-to-do people living in a kind of a debutante society in Manhattan. They would sit around and discuss their romantic lives, a lot of the romantic failures, obscure political figures, theorists, social conventions of the time, literature, some more known than others. And I love this movie, even though it's pretty, there's very little to do with it that would connect with me at my upbringing. But there's a genuineness about it, and just a pleasure of listening to young people talk about ideas and topics that you wouldn't normally, that weren't really being discussed in my circle of friends when I was growing up. And there's just a real sweetness about the film. And Stillman, the way he writes the dialogue for these characters is he really kind of appreciates the fact that he lets each person have these ideas, even though it may not jibe with moving the story forward or make the most riveting of cinema. If you like hearing people talk and recite dialogue in kind of a static setting, it's a very charming movie. I watched it probably 4 or 5 times, and every time I've seen it, I think just wow, how opposite this is of the way I grew up and spent my teenage years. The Deb Society wasn't me in Oklahoma, but nevertheless, I'm really attracted to the movie. Stillman's second movie was called Barcelona, and it was released in 1994, so 4 years after Metropolitan. And with Barcelona, he had a lot more of a budget. It was actually set in Barcelona, set in the early 80s, just as Metropolitan was. In fact, all three of Stillman's movies are set in this time period of the early 80s. He refers to them as kind of I don't know if he refers to them or if I've heard them being referred to them by others as being kind of a yuppie trilogy, because a lot of the characters talk about that sort of movement in the early 80s of upwardly mobile people in their 20s. And Barcelona is very similar to Metropolitan. It's characters, less characters this time. It kind of there's two main characters versus kind of a group of collective people that were in Metropolitan. Chris Eigeman is in this movie as well. He was in Metropolitan. He was one of the main characters in Metropolitan. And he also shows up in Last Days of Disco. As one of the characters in that as well. Barcelona, same kind of thing. If you like Metropolitan, you like Barcelona. It's just people sitting around talking, expressing ideas, bantering thoughts back and forth, some things you may have heard of before, some things you wouldn't. If the people are exasperating, people are charming, clever, frustrating. If you like Metropolitan, you'd like Barcelona. And I probably like Metropolitan a little more than Barcelona, even though I love the setting because it's kind of almost like a tourist look into Barcelona, because there's a lot of that on display. You get to see a lot of the city. And that brings us to Stillman's third film, Last Days of Disco. This is set, as the title may suggest, it's set in kind of the waning days of disco in New York. Kind of Studio 54 setup. There's a lot of time spent in discos with mirror balls and things falling from the ceiling, and scantily clad people dancing, and lots of disco. In fact, it's got a great soundtrack. If you like disco music, you'd probably enjoy it just for the soundtrack alone. It's the same thing. There's no action scenes. Nothing's going to happen that you haven't seen in any of the Stillman films before. The only thing kind of different about Last Days of Disco is, more so than in the other two films, although Metropolitan had a lot of conversations between females, the two leads in Last Days of Disco are actually female. They're, so you get to hear them talk a lot more, which is a kind of a different thing for him. As previously, most of the character leads were male, so a lot of the dialogue was male driven. Last Days of Disco, as probably Metropolitan is my favorite. Last Days of Disco, I probably like them in the order that they came out: Metropolitan, Last Days of Disco, and then or Barcelona, and then Last Days of Disco. All three are really good if you want to see just people exchanging ideas and talking. Not much happens, but there's just lots of interesting, witty, intelligent, smart dialogue between the characters. And if you watch a lot of movies, smart is always good in movies. So anyway, that is my first one of these. We'll see how it goes. I may try to do more in the future.